In the WWE, things can change quickly. You can go from being a top star to a jobber to fired in just moments, and sometimes it's entirely the fault of the wrestler themselves when that happens, and today we're going to discuss a few of those cases, so like the video and let's talk about it. Let's talk about WWE wrestlers who killed their careers in seconds. Paul London signed for the WWE in mid-2003, having spent the last few years making a name for himself on the indie scene, mainly in Ring of Honor. He started working dark matches and working in OVW before being called up to SmackDown on October 9th, where he would debut against Brock Lesnar in a WWE Championship match, and you can probably guess how this went. And Lesnar would beat up London post-match until a fellow jobber called Spanky would make the save, and this would be the start of a tag team between Paul London and the aforementioned Spanky, as they would team up on Velocity, but Spanky would leave the WWE in January 2004, disbanding the team. For now, and he'd start a tag team with Billy Kidman instead, and after only a few months they would win the WWE Tag Team Championships in July, and they defended the titles against the Dudleys and the Bashams before losing the titles to Rene Dupree and Kenzo Suzuki in September, after just 2 months after Kidman turned on London. This led to the two feuding with each other and Kidman beating London at No Mercy, and London being written off TV due to injury. He returned at the end of the year and would join up in the Cruiserweight division, where once again fairly quickly he rose up to the top of the division, winning the Cruiserweight title on March 31st, 2005, and he had a decent reign where it lasted just over 4 months as he feuded with Chavo Guerrero and the Mexicals throughout his reign before losing it to Nunzio on a Velocity episode. A decision that was probably not the original plan but had been changed, as Paul London had recently broken his nose after a botched 450 splash that was landed on him. About that later. And after that, it was straight into another division to quickly rise to the top of, as Paul London returned to the tag division and Spanky was back too, and under his new ring name of Brian Kendrick. Paul London and Brian Kendrick began teaming in December 2005, and it took them only 5 months to rise up through the tag division, picking up wins before they eventually won the tag titles from MNM at Judgment Day in May 2006, and Kendrick and London would have a generational tag title run here, and I mean generational. This tag title run lasted 332 days. They defended against the likes of the Hardys, the Pitbulls, Deuce and Domino and more before finally losing them in April of 2007, and this would be the longest tag title reign in WWE history before the New Day break that record just under a decade later. And following the end of this reign, London pretty much just became a jobber, and things would get even worse when Paul London supposedly killed his career by simply smiling in a backstage segment with Vince McMahon. I'm sure you might have heard this story before, but there was that angle back in 2007, the infamous Vince McMahon limo explosion angle, where just before he gets into the limo, he's walking throughout the locker room and all the wrestlers are shown staring at Vince McMahon, and Paul London distinctively has a big smile on his face. And according to Paul London, he already had heat backstage, and when that smile incident happened, it made things worse and was a catalyst for his eventual WWE release in 2008, which came after London had spent the better part of a year jobbing out, and him and Kendrick had been split up, with Kendrick starting his own run. And after leaving WWE, Paul London did various shoot interviews, burning pretty much every bridge and any chance he had of ever returning to the WWE. Juventud Guerrera has had a long and tenured wrestling career, wrestling all over the world, and to this day is still actively working. Juventud signed for the WWE in 2005, having worked in ECW, WCW and TNA prior to finally joining the WWE. He would debut on SmackDown in June and would quickly form the Mexicals stable alongside Super Crazy and Psychosis. And the Mexicals would start off pretty chaotically, as they were attacking wrestlers each week, and they even got a pay-per-view win over the Blue World Order at Great American Bash. Yes, that was a real pay-per-view match, as well as Juventud legit breaking Paul London's nose by botching a 450 splash. And after Great American Bash, the Mexicals would mainly start appearing on Velocity as they feuded with Nunzio and Vito over Nunzio's Cruiserweight title. Juventud would win a Battle Royal in October to become the #1 contender for the belt, and at No Mercy he would defeat Nunzio to win the WWE Cruiserweight Championship. Juventud would defend the title against Paul London on Velocity, then lose it at a live event in Italy back to Nunzio before winning it back again a week later on SmackDown. Apparently though, also around this time, Juventud Guerrero was also catching heat for his attitude backstage and his stiff working style, in particular injuring Paul London. Apparently his heat was so bad that Super Crazy and Psychosis distanced themselves from him backstage so that they didn't catch heat as well, and Juventud would lose the title to Kid Cash at Armageddon in December, and then on January 6, 2006, it was announced that Juventud had been released. And that evening his final match would air on SmackDown, as it was a rematch with Kid Cash, where in this match he was allegedly sandbagging Kid Cash, and he also hit the 450 splash on him, which was a banned move because of him hurting Paul London with it. Any chance of a future return was killed with this match, but heck, the guy is still going to this day, and he was even on AEW in 2021. They should do him versus Ivelisse. In 2007, Kevin Kiley signed a developmental contract with the WWE and would report to their developmental territory, Florida Championship Wrestling, or FCW. He originally started using the ring name of Kevin Kiley, his real name, but in September 2008 he would change his ring name to Carson Oakley. He started teaming with Scotty Goldman, aka Colt Cabana, who challenged the Hart Dynasty for the Florida Tag Team Championships in November unsuccessfully, and then in early December he would go through another rebrand and another name change, now calling himself Alex Riley, and playing the gimmick of a college football jock. And while in FCW, Alex Riley would win the FCW Florida Heavyweight Championship, defeating Justin Gabriel and Wade Barrett in a triple threat match on March 18th, 2010. He would hold the title until the July 22nd FCW tapings, when he lost the title to Mason Ryan in a triple threat match, also involving Johnny Curtis. Those are some names and a half. On the June 8th episode of NXT and the premiere of Season 2 of NXT, back when it was a weird game show, Alex Riley would make his debut, being pro'd by The Miz. Alex Riley did pretty well for himself on the NXT game show. He ended up being the top heel rookie and would come third on the show behind Michael McGillicutty and Koval. But despite not winning, he would join the main roster anyway, becoming The Miz's lackey and The Miz's partner. And Riley actually ended up becoming a pretty big part of WWE television, mainly thanks to the fact that he was there during the time that The Miz cashed in his Money in the Bank briefcase to win the WWE title, and he was there during The Miz's championship reign. Heck, he even walked out with him during the main event of WrestleMania 27. Alex Riley was involved in the main event of WrestleMania. On the May 23rd episode of Raw though, The Miz and Alex Riley's alliance came to an end. This was following The Miz losing the WWE Championship and blaming it on Alex Riley, causing Riley to attack him and turn face in the process. The feud would blow off at Capital Punishment 2011, remember that show, with Riley defeating The Miz clean. So yeah, Alex Riley had just defeated the guy that was just WWE Champion clean. And from here, he was a top babyface on the Raw brand. Well, maybe not a top babyface, but he was wrestling in the upper mid card, mixing it up with some big names, and was pretty over with the fans, to be fair to him. However, Alex Riley's push would come to an abrupt end, and apparently it had something to do with a backstage incident and some backstage troubles between himself and none other than John Cena. Arn Anderson, who was an agent in the WWE at the time, recalls the incident saying the following: "He seemed to gel well when they put him with The Miz in 2010, but there's a famous story that he was offered some help from John Cena and seemed less than enthused or interested, which would have immediately made it way back to the locker room and to the office. And I'm sure it was around the time that his water got cut off." In October 2011, Alex Riley suffered a hip injury that left him inactive for a few weeks, and when he came back, he was relegated to the likes of superstars and back to jobber status really. He went on a streak of losing matches in 2012, and after being used as a jobber for pretty much that entire year, he transitioned to a role of being a color commentator instead of a wrestler. He would do this a couple of years while making occasional in-ring appearances at live events, but he was not wrestling on TV until 2015, when Alex Riley would make his return as an in-ring competitor. It was a storyline that saw him being harassed on commentary by NXT champion Kevin Owens, Owens, and he would return to wrestling and would get some wins over the likes of CJ Parker and some other jobbers on the NXT roster, until Kevin Owens and him had matches, and Kevin Owens flatlined him and squashed him. And despite the fact he was losing to Kevin Owens, he was still in a good position here. He was doing well for himself back in NXT, but then on May 1st, 2015, it was announced that Alex Riley would be undergoing surgery to fix the degenerative arthritis in his knee. He made his return to NXT 8 months later in a winning effort against Bull Dempsey and turning heel in the process, but then after this he was straight back to losing and being a jobber again, and then he was released from the company on May 6th, 2016. After his release, Riley went inactive in wrestling. He actually got an acting role in the show Glow, but he has made his return to wrestling and is now working for the NWA, going under the name of the Rare Breed Kevin Kiley. Oh, and of course, who can forget Push Rage? My god, what an incredible moment that was. Kevin Patrick Wisholes made his wrestling debut in 1982, and he mainly wrestled in the Tennessee, Montreal, and Pacific Northwest territories. And throughout the 80s and early 90s, he wrestled for the likes of World Class Championship Wrestling, Mid-South Wrestling, New Japan Pro Wrestling, the American Wrestling Association, and Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling. He would make his first appearance for the WWF in 1989, when he received a tryout match on June 6, 1989. He would have another match for the WWF a night later, but WWF decided to pass on him and not sign him for the company at this time. He would receive a second tryout match for the WWF on May 6, 1991, following the closing of the American Wrestling Association. And while he wasn't signed immediately, he would officially join the company in early 1992, returning to the WWF under the name of Nails, with a Z at the end to be all cool and hip in the 90s, you know. And throughout his time as Nails in the WWF, he was mainly just used as a lower card guy. He was playing the role of an ex-convict who, in his promos, would allege that he was abused by Big Boss Man, who was a former prison guard during his incarceration. And while he was only used as a jobber in the WWF, Nails still had some programs with Sergeant Slaughter, Big Boss Man, The Undertaker, The Ultimate Warrior, and even had a few matches against the WWF champion at the time, Bret Hart. However, in December of 1992, he was released from his WWF contract after an incident in which he attacked Vince McMahon in his office. Bret Hart recalls the incident in his autobiography, and apparently the entire thing came from a financial dispute. Supposedly, Nails cornered Vince in his office and screamed at him for 15 minutes, and says that while he was just down the hall from the office, he heard a loud crash, which was the sound of Nails knocking Vince over his chair and choking him out. This led to a series of lawsuits between Nails and the WWF, with Nails alleging that he had been supplied steroids by Vince McMahon, and he also filed a wrongful termination lawsuit claiming McMahon had sexually assaulted him. The WWF would file a counterclaim against Nails, but both suits were later dropped. And seemingly he just disappeared from the wrestling industry following his firing from the WWE. The only record of any match I can find from Nails is on Cage Match from the 25th of August 2001 at an independent wrestling show where he was defeated by Matt Burns. This was seemingly his last ever wrestling match. What a throwback this entry is. Remember the days of Daniel Puder when he'd get mentioned in every single wrestling list? We are so back. Puder's first exposure to a wrestling audience was when he was an entrant in the 4th edition of WWE Tough Enough, this of course being the $1 Million Tough Enough, where the winner would receive a 4-year, $250K a year deal with the WWE. And unlike previous seasons of Tough Enough though, where it was just its own standalone reality TV series, the $1 Million Tough Enough was just a weekly segment on SmackDown. And among the contestants on $1 Million Tough Enough were Ryan Reeves, who would go on to become Ryback, Mike Mizanin, and of course, Daniel Puder, amongst others. Puder was a standout on the show for the fact he was an ex-MMA fighter, something that was often brought up by other wrestlers and competitors on the show. One of the side effects of Tough Enough being on SmackDown though, which is quite obvious, was the fact that it meant they were sharing a locker room and TV time with active members of the WWE roster and members of the SmackDown brand. And this often had a crossover with active members of the roster appearing in Tough Enough segments, such as the time Big Show ran them all down in the locker room, or such as the time Kurt Angle challenged them all to a squat thrust competition. On the November 4th, 2004 episode of SmackDown, Kurt Angle would get involved with Tough Enough when he hosted a squat thrust contest, with the winner getting an amateur match against Kurt Angle as their prize. Chris Naroki won the contest, and as a result he got his match with Angle, where his ribs got broken and he was tapped out in just moments. And following this match, Angle thought he would then challenge Daniel Puder to a match, given that Daniel Puder had an MMA background and he used it to mock him as he challenged him. Daniel Puder of course accepted, the match begun, and very quickly Daniel Puder got in control of Kurt Angle when he locked in a Kimura lock on Kurt Angle's arm. A Kimura lock that sure as hell was about to break Kurt Angle's arm until the referee had to intervene and count a shoot 3 count on Puder's shoulders, which weren't fully entirely down. Something that was done to save Kurt Angle's arm from being snapped by Daniel Puder. It was a very strange moment, but nonetheless, Tough Enough would continue, with Daniel Puder going on to win the contest and win that 4-year, $250k a year contract. And he would make his official debut for the WWE in the Royal Rumble match 2005, and when he entered the Royal Rumble match, he was given a very warm welcome, to say the least. He entered at number 3 and would spend 4 minutes getting chopped up by Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit and Hardcore Holly before he was dumped out by Hardcore Holly, being the first elimination of the match. Just a complete burial for a debut in the WWE and a punishment for what he had done to Kurt Angle. And this would also end up being his final ever match on the WWE main roster. He was demoted to OVW for developmental purposes, but he would only last 8 months later before he was released from his contract and was never seen again in the WWE. You probably might be wondering who on earth Robbie McAllister is, and I wouldn't blame you. His most famous WWE moment was how he got fired, and it technically didn't even happen in the WWE. We'll get there, okay? So Robbie McAllister was one half of the Highlanders, a Scottish tag team made up of himself and his brother Rory McAllister. They made their wrestling debut in 2001 and would wrestle on the Indies for a few years before in 2005 they were signed to the WWE. They signed in July and reported to OVW, which was developmental at the time, and they spent only a few months in developmental before their main roster debut started getting teased in mid-2006, and sure enough, in July 2006 they would make their debut on Monday Night Raw. And they'd go on a bit of a win streak, as for the next 3 weeks they would squash other tag teams weekly until they got a title shot at the Spirit Squad, and when they lost that match they were jobbers for the rest of their WWE careers, and it became very rare to see them win unless it was on heat. They literally had 3 weeks of wins and WWE were like, yeah, nah, we're done with you. On another note though, this era's tag division sounds absolutely cooked. The Highlanders versus the Spirit Squad for the titles, bloody hell man. And the Highlanders did nothing for the next 2 years in WWE except for jobbing, with their appearances mainly coming from heat and their Raw appearances being very occasional. But WWE still kept them around regardless, and they still had a job with the company. Even if they were jobbing, they were clearly seen as useful in their jobber roles. But in March of 2008, an incident would take place with Robbie that would destroy both of their WWE careers. On the 27th of March 2008, TNA were broadcasting an Impact episode, and Robbie McAllister was in attendance at the show. Of course, he's in the WWE, and we know this, we know he was at the show because he was shown on camera live on TNA and on TV. And reportedly, following his sighting at the TNA show, Robbie would receive an angry phone call from WWE officials ordering him to leave the show immediately, and as a result, he was made to miss WrestleMania that was in just a few weeks, be squashed by JBL in a minute in a match that probably got booked in Wrestlers Court, and 3 months later him and his brother Rory were both fired, and him showing up at TNA has largely been blamed for why they were fired. If we're being real, knowing Vince McMahon, he probably didn't even know these two existed before Robbie showed up on TNA. And regardless if they were jobbers or not, the Highlanders still were working in the WWE, and after Robbie turned up in TNA and ultimately got the two of them fired, Robbie would continue to wrestle and even have a match as recently as last month at 49 years old, but he was never able to reach anywhere near WWE ever again, and TNA didn't even give him the hire for getting him fired. Like, come on lads, that's the least you could have done. Brad Maddox debuted for the WWE in 2008, at first being part of OVW, which was the WWE developmental territory at the time, under the name of Brent Wellington. He stuck around in OVW for a while, but hadn't actually been signed to the WWE, but that would change in mid-2010 when he was finally signed to a WWE contract, sent to FCW and renamed to Brad Maddox. And Brad Maddox would have a nice run in FCW, spending 2 years there, winning the Florida tag titles twice and the Jack Briscoe 15 championship once, because yes, that is a real title belt. It was a title belt that could only be contested in 15-minute Iron Man matches, the more you know. And he was also the final champion for both of these belts, but like I said, he would spend 2 years in FCW, being there from 2010 until 2012, when WWE decided it was time to call him up to the main roster after FCW shut down. He was called up to the main roster in August 2012, but despite being a wrestler and wrestling in the WWE system for over 4 years now, WWE instead opted to use him as a referee instead. He would start refereeing random matches on TV and would of course be the referee for the CM Punk vs Ryback match at Hell in a Cell 2012, where he would be introduced to WWE fans after costing Ryback the win and the WWE title. Brad Maddox would explain his actions, stating that he always dreamed of being a WWE wrestler but kept on getting rejected, so he cost Ryback to try and make a name for himself and get a job with the WWE. An interesting idea, but one that would ultimately be a bust, as Brad Maddox was presented as nothing but a jobber after this. He would start a storyline where he would hang around Raw and SmackDown trying to get a job and facing top stars to try and earn a contract, but just getting squashed. And after this concluded, WWE would go into the next idea for Brad Maddox, which would be to make him the Raw Assistant General Manager to Vicky Guerrero, which they did on the February 18, 2013 episode of Raw. However, he ultimately lasted only 4 months in this role, as in July, he was promoted to the main General Manager position. Brad Maddox though wasn't very memorable as Raw GM, and when the Authority were introduced at SummerSlam in August, just a month after, he pretty much became useless in his role and fizzled out as an authority figure after numerous attacks by Randy Orton and the Authority. He would then be taken off TV entirely and only work exclusively house shows and dark matches, sticking around in the company all the way until November of 2015, with only 1 match on Main Event and an Andre the Giant Battle Royal cameo being his only TV wrestling appearances. And that was before he was suddenly released from the company that month in November of 2015. And people weren't surprised to see Brad Maddox was released, as clearly the WWE had no plans for him, but the reason he was released was actually surprising, as reportedly he was released for using the phrase "cocky pricks" in a promo during a dark segment. A puzzling reason to fire someone, as not only was language like this not uncommon in the WWE, but it was also literally untelevised. Nobody saw it. But maybe WWE were just looking for an excuse to fire Brad Maddox. Ultimately though, Brad Maddox did pretty much nothing after the CM Punk Ryback match, and is perhaps best known for a series of leaked videos he was involved in, rather than his actual stint in the WWE. Bronson Matthews, otherwise known by his real name of Josh Bredel, was a contestant on the 6th season and 2015 edition of WWE Tough Enough. If you don't know somehow, Tough Enough was WWE's reality show where hopeful WWE wrestlers would live together and do challenges each episode, with the public voting for eliminations and a winner, with the winner getting a WWE contract. And despite no prior wrestling experience, Josh was very impressive on this Tough Enough season and made a name for himself as the Yeti, accompanied by his signature Yeti call. He was a fan favorite on the show, so much so that he would win the whole damn thing, making it to the live finals of the show and beating out runner-up ZZ to be the men's winner of WWE Tough Enough Season 6. In September of 2015, he was assigned to NXT and would begin reporting to the Performance Center, and in December of 2015, he would start making appearances on live events where his name was revealed as Bronson Matthews, with his official debut match coming soon and fans anticipating it. However, something you might already be aware of is that Tough Enough is completely cursed, as the majority of Tough Enough winners most of the time usually don't go on to do much in the WWE and can be often met with hostility from the rest of the WWE locker room. Daniel Puder for example, and fans wondered if it would be the same case for Josh, and sure enough, Bronson Matthews' WWE career would become completely cursed after one fateful day on Twitter in January 2016. On January 18th, Josh was live tweeting Raw and tweeted out saying, "Yup, I like it, #socialjobbers," in reference to the Social Outcast stable, and this was a tweet that would catch a lot of heat from fellow WWE locker room members for his use of the word jobber, and they would start publicly shaming him. Kevin Owens would tweet out, "Look at the veteran here with the big fancy insider terms," before announcing that he had blocked him, and Cody Rhodes would tweet out calling him a dick and telling him to enjoy getting dressed in the hallway, and then there was Heath Slater, who was a member of the Social Outcast, who would clown on him for deleting the initial tweet. Josh would acknowledge his mistake, but the damage was done, and despite finally making his WWE debut and beginning to work NXT house shows, this day on Twitter pretty much destroyed his entire WWE career. He wrestled his final match at a live event on July 7th, 2016 before he would be pulled off live events and would sit at home all the way until November 5th, 2017 when he was released from his WWE contract. Josh has not been involved in wrestling since, and whilst it's hard to predict how far he could have gone in wrestling, it's no doubt that that one singular tweet did irreversible damage to his WWE career. Mandy Rose was also a part of the 6th season of Tough Enough, but as opposed to Josh, she would finish runner-up on the show, but also as opposed to Josh, Mandy would have a pretty successful WWE career in the end. She was signed to the company despite not winning Tough Enough and would start wrestling in NXT under the name of Mandy Rose. She was used as a jobber at first, but surprisingly, she would make her WWE main roster debut on the November 20th, 2017 episode of Raw, debuting alongside fellow Tough Enough contestant Sonya Deville, aligning themselves with Paige by attacking the women of Raw and forming the stable Absolution. However, Absolution wouldn't end up lasting very long, as Paige was forced into retirement and would announce the retirement on the Raw after WrestleMania 34, effectively ending the stable, but Mandy and Sonya would continue on as a tag team, dubbing themselves Fire and Desire. They would move over to SmackDown, and Fire and Desire were definitely in a better spot than before, but still weren't quite there yet. The two were on the SmackDown brand, where they did all kinds of antics, such as when Mandy Rose tried to steal Jimmy Uso from Naomi in one of the most wild modern WWE storylines. Rose and Deville would also compete in the Elimination Chamber to crown the first women's tag team champions, but would finish the match runners-up, and Rose would also compete at the WrestleMania Women's Battle Royal and the Women's Money in the Bank, but once again still coming up short. Reportedly though, she was actually meant to compete for the SmackDown Women's Championship at Mania, but the match got scrapped, and Mandy and Sonya would spend the rest of the year instead pursuing the tag titles but never reaching them. In 2020 though, we'd see a shakeup of Mandy Rose's character as Fire and Desire would break up, as during a love triangle storyline with Otis and Dolph Ziggler, Sonya Deville was revealed by the SmackDown hacker, remember him, to have messed with Otis and Mandy Rose's date, and this of course led to that wholesome Mania moment with the two of them. For whatever reason though, the WWE never chose to follow up on this, and now with Mandy Rose as a babyface, chose instead to pair her in a throwaway tag team with Dana Brooke, which never went anywhere. And seemingly at some point, WWE came into the realization that Mandy Rose is much better off as a heel, as in July 2021 she would return to the NXT brand on her own as a heel once again with a whole new look, and would quickly re-establish herself in NXT in a big way. She would take JC Jane and Gigi Dolan under her wing, and they formed the Toxic Attraction, and the Toxic Attraction found great success, as at Halloween Havoc 2021, JC and Gigi first won the NXT Women's Tag titles before Mandy Rose defeated Raquel to win the NXT Women's Championship, her first and only title win ever. And Mandy Rose would have a long and very successful title reign. She defended the title against the likes of Cora Jade, Dakota Kai, Io Sky, Roxanne, Zoe Stark, Blair Davenport, Miko Satomura, Alba Fire, and more. But in December 2022, Mandy Rose's reign would come crashing down when earlier in that month, explicit photos that Mandy Rose had posted on her exclusive fan site leaked online, and reportedly, WWE wasn't aware of the type of content that Mandy Rose was posting and became aware of it after it was leaked. And it's against WWE's policy to be posting this kind of content, and so because of this, Mandy would be made to drop dropped the title to Roxanne on the December 13th NXT episode before a day later she was shockingly released from her WWE contract. Despite an over year-long dominant title reign and WWE building her up a ton, she had broken the rules and WWE had acted on it by, as I said, firing her. And it's a shame, as Mandy was easily doing the best work of her career and had really come into her own. But while this killed her wrestling career, maybe it's unfair to say this killed her career as a whole, as reportedly she's now making way more money from OnlyFans than she ever did in her entire WWE career. And she also hasn't ruled out a WWE return in the future, so hopefully that's something we can see. Ken Anderson was signed to the WWE in February 2005 and would report down to OVW, and he had a tumultuous first couple of months in the company, as according to him, Jim Cornette, who was in charge of OVW at the time, didn't see much in him. But when Jim Cornette was fired and Paul Heyman came in to replace him, he showed much more interest in him and called him up to the main roster immediately. He mainly wrestled as a jobber on the B shows like Velocity and Heat when he was first called up, going through various name changes before finally landing on Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy would make his SmackDown debut in August of 2005 and would begin a win streak for himself on the brand. This win streak would last for 4 months before he was finally defeated by Eddie Guerrero in November. And Mr. Kennedy attacked him post-match and it looked like a program was going to be starting between the two, but tragically Eddie Guerrero passed away just 2 days later, meaning Mr. Kennedy has the unfortunate honor of being Eddie Guerrero's final match. Mr. Kennedy would continue on but would face injury during a WWE Italy tour and would be out for 6 months, potentially stalling his career. However, WWE were clearly intent on pushing him because when he returned months later, Mr. Kennedy was straight back to winning ways, and in September 2006, he won the United States Championship, his first and only WWE title win. He would lose the title after only a month, but luckily for him, WWE had even bigger plans for him as he set his sights on the world title and even challenged for the big gold at the 2007 Rumble against Batista. He came out unsuccessful, but his future chances of winning the title increased when he won the Money in the Bank ladder match at WrestleMania 23, the biggest win of his career so far, before he put the briefcase on the line in a random TV match against Edge, which Edge ended up winning because there was a fear Mr. Kennedy suffered a major injury and they changed the finish of the match. And while it was true that Kennedy did get injured, it wasn't as major as they thought, and maybe not enough for him to lose the Money in the Bank briefcase, so he kind of lost the briefcase for no reason at all. And when Kennedy returned from this injury, WWE had one final plan to finally propel him to the top and finally give him that push they've wanted to give him but keep getting delayed on. And that was by having him be revealed as Vince McMahon's illegitimate son. It was all made up, it made perfect storyline sense, and then he got suspended for steroids. We instead got Hornswoggle being revealed as Vince's son, and WWE completely gave up on pushing Mr. Kennedy after this. Kennedy was one of 11 total WWE wrestlers who were suspended for taking steroids at the same time as him, and it effectively killed his career as he coasted around on the WWE roster for 2 years after this, doing pretty much nothing but just floating around in the mid-card. But the final straw was when he nearly injured Randy Orton on an April 2009 Raw episode by botching a move during a match. Orton complained backstage to management and Mr. Kennedy was fired by the WWE 4 days later. Mr. Kennedy would end up going to TNA where he would get his world title run as Mr. Anderson, and it was a decent run he had in TNA, but you can't help but think where he could have reached in the WWE had he not got caught for steroids and all the bad luck he had faced before that. Eva Marie signed for the WWE in May of 2013 when she claims that she came across a casting call for the WWE by chance and impressed during a 4-week long tryout. and the first order of business with her since signing her WWE contract was to add her to the brand new reality show that was debuting titled Total Divas, a reality show that went behind the scenes of the lives of WWE divas, airing on the E! Network. And let's be real, this was probably the main reason that Eva Marie was signed in the first place, just to star on this show. She was wrestling on the main roster, having had just 2 weeks of formal training, and in her performances and her matches, it very clearly showed she was called up far too quickly. She mainly wrestled in tag matches and multi-person matches such as battle royales or gauntlets or any multi-person tag team match, and the occasional time she did compete in a singles match, it usually wasn't the greatest. In November of 2015, she would go inactive with the WWE for a while due to injury, and during this time she would start training with Brian Kendrick. She would make her return to WWE, this time in NXT in June of 2015, and she seemed to have a bit of new skill behind her. She was clearly a lot of a better wrestler. Still not great, but she was actually starting to get a decent reaction from the Full Sail crowd. That was until she had a match against Billie Kay in which she forgot to kick out and the referee had to stop at a 2 count, and you could tell that she had forgot to kick out. The crowd turned on her and it was kinda over for her in NXT from there. She did have an alliance with Nia Jax and did even compete for the title against Bayley and Asuka, but she was never to win the NXT Women's Championship, and she was called back up to the main roster in 2016. She was drafted to SmackDown in the 2016 SmackDown draft, and she would begin a character in SmackDown where it was actually quite interesting. She was playing a heel who was just finding any excuse to not appear for her matches. Whether it was a wardrobe malfunction, being stuck in traffic, or anything, Eva Marie would find an excuse not to compete in a match. She was scheduled to be part of a 6-woman tag match at that year's SummerSlam event, however, she would be replaced by Nikki Bella as she was suspended for 30 days on August 18th for violating the company's wellness policy. Eva Marie claims that she tested positive for Adderall, that she had a prescription for the medication, but submitted the paperwork after the deadline, and this caused some angry tweets from her husband towards the WWE, which probably can't have been good for her. And yeah, she never appeared for the WWE ever again after the suspension. She actually stayed within the company for close to a year after, before she announced on August 4th, 2017 that she had parted ways with the WWE. Sensationally, she actually returned to the WWE in 2021, however this run did not last very long. It was very uninspired, she got booed and hated throughout all of it, and she was released that same year from budget cuts due to the pandemic. Though Eva Marie to this day is expressing interest in a return again to the WWE, and if it did happen, to be honest, I wouldn't be very surprised.